All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about responsive web design. We're going to be doing this or doing these following exercises within the React environment. Now, all of today is going to be concentrated within a CSS style sheet where you are going to be messing a little bit around with the application process, but we're not really going to be talking too much about our use state, use effect, or any components or much of the React world. We're kind of taking a step back, going back into CSS, giving everybody a chance to let everything else actually sink in and be absorbed. So in part one of our lecture, we'll be covering display, position, z-index, float, overflow, and pseudo classes. We can actually leave z-index for the end. And then in part two of our application, of our lesson today, we'll be talking about responsive units such as percentage signs, view height and view width, vmin and vmax, EMs, and rems. We'll also talk about Flexbox and how Flexbox works, and then media queries to make sure that you have a responsive site. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we'll be covering today? All right, doesn't seem like we have any questions, so let's go ahead and dive into our lecture here. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is display. We're going to create a React application utilizing Vite by running the command npm create Vite, putting a period afterwards so that it's happening within this directory. I'm going to go into React, JavaScript, install all of my dependencies. And then run my development server. All right, I'm go ahead and open this up here. There's my React application. Let me get rid of some of this default code that it would come in with. I'm going to go into app CSS and get rid of all of it. I'm going to go into index CSS and again, get rid of all of that information. And then go into app.jsx. I don't really need any of this, so I'm going to get rid of it and bring it down to a simple H1 element. All right, for display, there's a couple of different ways to write display or to demonstrate display um, inside of HTML. And sometimes these displays come in already pre-built. We have block, inline, and inline block. We're going to take a look at a couple of these differences. Now, block are usually identified by division tags. We can see here we have a body tag, which is almost like a division tag, the section, which almost equates to div. Then we have header tags and paragraph tags, which are also block tags. Now, what block tags mean, if I go ahead and inspect this here, I go to select an element, you can see that if I hover over that H1, the H1 is consuming the entire space of my application from the upper left hand or from the left side of the screen all the way to the right hand side of the screen. It is a block. If I go ahead and create multiple of these H1 elements, and I hover over each one of them, we have one block. They're not being adjacent to one another. It's occupying the entire screen from left to right. The next element falls right below it, occupies the entire screen from left to right. And then the last element, once again, falls right below it and occupies the entire screen from left to right. That's what block stands for. Now we have something like inline block or inline. Inline usually falls with span. More of our decoration tags will have an inline display. And then we have inline block, which is something like an image. So let's go ahead and take a look at our Poke API one more time, just to grab our ditto. sprites, front default. Take that ditto there. And here I'm just going to create a couple of images. Now that I have these images being generated, let's take a look at our application. Well, now notice that Hello Zulu is still occupying from left to the right-hand side of the screen. That's still a block of display. But now we have these images, and these images are an inline block. They are all occupying the same line and showing us the image being displayed on the screen within the same line of my screen. So for example, Hello Zulu, this is occupying the entire block. But now images, instead of occupying the entire block, they are an inline block, meaning they could be adjacent to one another and share the space of their independent block. All right, let's see a different example here. I'm going to start bringing up some boxes and containers here. I'm going to have a division with the ID of boxes, or let's do ID of container. This is going to have a class or a child division with box. Let's do this one times 9. There you go. Now let's just number them.
Could you go back? What did you just do when you did times 9?
Let me go ahead and copy this, and then now. Is this what you're referencing to?
Yep.
So what this is doing, this is just shorthand or CSS shorthand, or excuse me, HTML shorthand. I am establishing that I want to create a div. This div will have the ID of container. The pound sign is what signifies the ID. And then saying it's going to have some children by putting that greater than sign. The children that it will have will be a division. These divisions will have the class of box. And by putting this times 9, I'm essentially doing, hey, I want 9 of these divisions with the class of box. When I press enter, I have 9 divisions with the class of box and 1 parental division with the ID of container. Did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Now let's take a look at this container and these divisions that are inside of it. Let me go into my app CSS. Add a little bit of CSS here. All right. So now these are all divisions. They come in with default inline blocks inside of them. We can see that our container itself, and this might be easier if I do it here. You can see that this division of container, when I hover over it, it's occupying the entire space from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen, right? That margin that's coming here, we know that's coming from the body itself, that it comes with a default margin. And that's what's stopping it from being able to reach the actual edges of my screen. If I open up that division and I come down to each child box, each box is again in block, or has the style display of block, which is the reason why it occupies the entire space from the division from left to right before starting a new element. Now we want to change that. I go to the box class and I say, hey, the display that I want now is in line. Well, when I change it to being in line, rather than utilizing the entire screen, it's just rendering each element. It's saying, well, it's essentially changing it from display, or it's changing the direction from column to a row. Right now, everything falls within a row, and each individual box is only occupying the space necessary to fit the content that it's currently holding. So if I come over to app.jsx, and let's say I take box 5, and instead of showing 5, I type in some lorem ipsum, well, that changes the amount of space that box 5 is going to need. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4. All of a sudden, box 5 takes over. Notice that the height is only as much as it needs in order to fit the content that's been described. And then as soon as box 5 finishes, we pick up right where we left off with box 6, 7, 8, and 9. Right? That's inline display. Now there's got to be a happy medium where I could keep my height and width and also have everything displaying from left to right. Well, that happy medium is inline block. By adding inline block, we don't see much of a difference because currently right now we're not describing a height and width, but everything's still falling from left to right. So let's go ahead and describe that. Let's say height is going to be, let's go with 25 pixels. Let's say width is also 25 pixels. Oh, we need something greater than that. Let's see, we have 9 boxes. Let's make it 10, just so that we could have an extra one to occupy the space. Let's leave our height at 100%. And let's change this to 10%. And we'll go into the units of measurement here shortly, so don't think too much about it just yet. All right, so there you go. I have my parental division, which is utilizing 10%. And notice how when I squeeze it, the 10% still changes, but nothing drops down below, right? Nothing drops in the next line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Everything stays with their block directive. Well, now if I change this to being inline rather than inline block, even though I have my width and height to describe it, it's ignoring that width attribute. It's not keeping it anymore. Once I place it in inline, it's only occupying the space necessary to fit the content, but it's no longer respecting that width attribute. If I bring it back to block, now it's also respecting the width attribute, but even though it's not the division itself is not occupying the entire space from left to right, it's not allowing any elements to fall to the left or right hand side of it. It's cutting it off. So our happy medium is inline block. It keeps our width, but it also displays elements from left to right. Does anyone have any questions about this?
Wait, so just block, what does block ignore? So you said inline block ignores height. Does block ignore something?
Block does not ignore anything. No.
Oh,
So inline ignores width.
okay.
Block doesn't ignore neither the height nor the width,
Okay.
but it doesn't allow elements to fall to the left or right hand side of it, depending on where things are being displayed.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, let's switch this up a little bit. Can go ahead and add a width component here. This width component is going to be of, let's say, 200 pixels. Oh, it's a little too small. Let's make it 500. There you go. So now we have our 500 pixels. Let's go ahead and make our height of, let's say, 100. Let's go with 50, actually. 50 pixels. There you go. Now our width, instead of being 10% here, we're going to say that the width for every single one of these boxes will be 50 pixels. And then we'll say that the height will also be 50 pixels. Now I'm getting a little bit of an overflow there. Why is that happening?
Because the amount of boxes add up to more space than the pixels for the container will allow.
Interesting. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at that. So the amount of boxes allow for, or it's too much, basically. If I click on a box is only occupying 50 pixels.
Because the border is counted.
Perfect. So we're counting the border on both the left and right hand side, which is putting me at 52. So let's go ahead and make that into 48. And now we are able to fit all 10 of our boxes inside of that 500 pixels. Just want to throw that little bit of that little exercise in there, make sure everyone is tracking. Utilize your box model whenever you're trying to fit things in between. I've seen many students try to wonder why things aren't necessarily fitting in a division the way it's supposed to, or why it's nesting over to the next row. Take a look at this box model. Make sure that you're accounting for the borders, padding, and margin, because that could get in the way as far as how to squeeze things within your box. Again, if I switch this to inline, everything goes to the top left-hand corner, and it's only the information that I need, or it's only the width that I need to be able to fit the content. If I place it in block, even though I set a specific height, I'm bleeding out of my parent division of container and still falling from top to bottom without allowing any information to fill in on the right-hand side. So in order to keep everything nice and clean, we go with inline block, which is our happy medium, ensuring that all of our boxes stay inside of the container. All right, does anyone have any questions about this? Perfect. If there aren't any questions, let's go ahead and start talking about positioning here. So we have position static, position relative, and we're going to talk about how each one of these work. Let me go ahead and give an ID to one of our boxes here in box 5. We're also going to give it an ID of the box to be able to interact with it. We're just going to change the positioning of this box here. Let's see what happens when I run position fixed. Well, when I run position fixed, notice that 5 and 6 still fall on top of one another. both of the elements are essentially living or rendering on top of one another. Right after box 4 renders on that edge, box 5 renders like it's supposed to, but because it's fixed, it doesn't occupy the space. It doesn't say, hey, well, there's nothing that could fall in here. Instead, box 6 renders right next to it. What does position fixed give us as far as power to move information? Well, know that if I go top and I put 0, well, now that box falls to the upper corner. Does the pound? Jack, I'm seeing your question here on the Zoom chat. The question is, does the pound sign or the period serve different meanings? If we're talking about how they serve here inside of CSS, the pound means that we are referencing an ID, and the period means that we are referencing a class. Does that answer your question? I see the thumbs up. Perfect. All right. So again, I run position fixed. If I go top, it places it on the top of my screen. If I go left and I say 0, it's going to place it on the top left-hand side of my screen. If you ever have a project, let me go ahead and add a couple of boxes here. If you ever have a project where you're able to scroll, but you need something to stay on the upper left-hand corner, or you need something to stay in a specific position in the screen throughout the entire time, well, when I use position fixed, that number 5 or that box with the number 5 inside of it stays, regardless of where I go. Let me just go ahead and give it a background color here so that we can see it all the time. All right, I can move from top to bottom and everything stays in its exact location. If I want it to be pinned to the right-hand side, I could always just say right instead of left, and that pins it on the right-hand side of my screen. So that's position fixed. Does anyone have any questions about position fixed? All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so let's go ahead and talk about position relative next. And let me just come over to app CSS and remove these 100 boxes that we created. All right, so position relative. Currently right now, nothing really changed when I pass that position relative. Everything's still rendering where it's supposed to, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The 6 and the 5 aren't overlapping. So what does position relative actually do for me? Let's start passing some top and bottom attributes. Let's say top is 10 pixels. Well, that moved it from its current location down by 10 pixels. So if I pass in left 25 pixels, that would move it from its original location to the right 25 pixels. Now, even though I'm moving it to the right-hand side, the space that it's occupying when it's rendering in HTML, it's still very much the space that we have here. As far as my CSS layout goes, box 5 still exists in here. Even though I'm moving it throughout the screen, the DOM thinks that this is where box 5 is being rendered. And it will keep that original location for us. Even if I move it all the way to the entire other side, box 5 is still very much occupying its original location when it comes to the display. So position relative doesn't really seem too useful as of now, right? Maybe if there's something where I need to keep information, keep it located in one spot, then great. But that doesn't
What
really.
attribute?
Oh, go
Sorry,
ahead.
sorry. Which attribute was it that allowed 5 and 6 to be overridden by one another?
Oh, that was position fixed.
Okay.
So now let's talk about position relative in a different sense. What happens if I give position relative to the container? And instead of having position fixed, I can do something like position absolute. Well, when I run to position absolute, 5 and 6 are now overlapping again. But notice that 6 is invisible. That's because 5 is on top of our number 6. But now if we pass in that top and bottom attribute of top 100 pixels, notice that it's not referenced. Well, that doesn't really give me a good clear vision there. Let me go ahead and run left here. Left, 200 and well, let's do 25 pixels. Notice that it's not referencing from its original location. It's not going top 100 pixels down and then going left 25 pixels. That's not the movement that we're seeing from this division here, or from this box of the number 5. Instead, what we're actually seeing is from the top of the container, because this is the relative container, we're going to go down 100 pixels. And then from the left-hand side of my container, because this is, again, the relative container, we're going to go left 25 pixels. And that's how we end up with our box here on the lower right-hand side, rather than going down and left and seeing box 5 down here. Because I gave the relative attribute to the container, when I run position absolute, absolute is looking for its parent relative division in order to be as referenced. If I hadn't nested within another division, it would just look at whichever one has position relative inside of it. So let's go ahead and do that one as a practice. Let's do div outer. This is going to have a div of middle, and that's going to have a div of inner. All right. Let me go ahead and grab both of these and add a class in there. And let's just call this nested. We're just going to take a look at this example. I apologize for going a little silent, everyone. I'm just making sure that the CSS is adding up here. All right. There you go. So now we have our CSS. We have our inner, middle, and outer. Now I'm going to make this inner be of position absolute. And when I run it into position absolute, you'll notice that its entire size changes. All right. Well, right now, its size is of height and width of 50%. Now, because it's absolute and it doesn't have a parent division that is holding the relative attribute, it essentially thinks, and let me actually grab this here and bring it down below. It essentially thinks that its parent attribute is the entire body. So that's why we see this position absolute or this change in size. Well, what happens when I run position relative to the middle? Well, when I run position relative to the middle, now it's looking at its parent division and saying, oh, I'm only supposed to be 50% of that. It is position absolute to its parent relative division. It has to have the relative attribute. If I take this relative attribute and I remove it from the middle and place it on the outer division, you'll notice we don't see the green anymore. That's because both both middle and inner share the same size of 50% for height and width. But because we are in position relative to outer, middle and inner are now exactly the same size of 50% of the outer division, and it's covering it up because our inner is in relation to now our outer division. Does anyone have any questions regarding position relative and position absolute and how they relate to one another?
I guess I see how it could be confusing, like adding a bunch of different elements with absolute and relative. If you had like, I'm just saying if you added like absolute and relative to like 10 different boxes, how it could start getting kind of confusing. Who's parent to what.
Yeah, so it's always going to look to its nearest position relative. So you'll notice here, now that we have position relative both on the outer and inner, it's going to look at its parent first. So here, inner is a position absolute, and it's just looking upward, which the first division that comes that has position relative, that's the one that we'll utilize as a reference. Right, so if by the moment I remove it from middle, then the outer becomes the parent.
Wait, so when you put absolute without the outer having, I believe, relative, or without the middle or the outer having relative, why does it choose the outer as the body to take up all the space
Because since it
instead
doesn't
of like,
go ahead, keep going.
I don't know, I was gonna say instead of like the whole screen, since what parent does it choose?
Yeah, so it is the body is representing our whole screen, right?
Mm,
So because there is no division down below that's holding any sort of attribute saying, hey, this is a relative, it just falls to the body. And that's why we see a 50% of the body. Right? When I close this out, as my body gets skinnier, so does my box. And if my body was to get taller or shorter, we would see our box grow and shorten along with my screen.
So it ends up just defaulting to the body.
Correct.
Hmm.
All right. Any other questions?
This is going to be unrelated, but do you mind going to app.jsx real quick? There's something I noticed. So when you say class name here, is that when you normally define like a class in HTML, you would just say class, but in React, you have to say class name.
Yeah, so in React, you have to say class name because classes are a thing in JavaScript. So if I were to use class, it would be a reserved keyword, as you see here. So in order to fix that, they just changed the attribute naming convention for the class within HTML to be class name.
Okay.
Thank you for pointing that out. All right, perfect. Let's go ahead and move forward to our next example here. In this next example, we're just going to have a division. This division will hold a paragraph tag with some lorem ipsum, and we will hold an image tag as well. Oh. There you go. All right, so here's our lorem ipsum. Then we grab our Pokemon image one more time. And actually, I'm just going to grab it from down here. Nice little ad there. All right. So there's our lorem ipsum, some paragraph text with our tag there. So let's go ahead and do this whole, this is an image here. And we're going to try the float me text here. Actually, I'm going to place this as an ID. We don't really need this portion here. All right, so currently inside of this division that we are working with, we have some text and we have an image that I've given the ID of Pokey image to. And essentially what I want to do is I want to interact with this image to make it float either to the left-hand side or the right-hand side of my text. I could do that by adding the float attribute and say, hey, I want to float this right. And now by floating it right, it is falling to the right-hand side of my division. Interesting. What is happening here? Why is that happening? Let me comment out this code to make sure that I'm not getting any weird behavior. Let's see. There it is. All right, so there's my image. Everything is in there. I have my text. I don't know how, but I am messing this up. It may have to do with the order at which I'm displaying this. Yep, that will do it. All right, so the issue that I was running into is I put the image down below after the paragraph tag rather than before the paragraph tag. I had it after, so it wasn't floating it correctly. Let me go ahead and show it without that float one more time. So if I take off that float class, here we have our image in inline block, but our paragraph tag is in block. All right, if I hover over them, here's my inline block, and then my paragraph tag is in block. So it's not allowing for anything to fall to the left or right hand side of it. So in order to fix that, I just simply add the float. And by adding float, I am now placing my image to the right hand side. If I hover over the paragraph tag is still assuming the block. But now it's also allowing for space for our image that we've created. If I put more lorem ipsum in there, it's going to be here, just to occupy more space. You'll notice that it starts wrapping around the image. I'm going to go ahead and add a border here. Starts wrapping around the image. If I go to float left, it will float the image to the left-hand side, and the text will wrap around it on the right. Now there's also the clear attribute. Say, hey, for this paragraph tag, I want to add the clear attribute of clear left. Well, now it's not allowing for this float left to work. All right, it's essentially canceling out. It's saying nothing will be to the left-hand side of this paragraph tag. I can still float to the right hand, but I can't go to the left-hand side because everything on the left-hand side will remain clear. Same thing if I add the clear right attribute, then it wraps. But if I try to float my image to the right, because I have this clear right, it won't allow for the text to wrap around. Instead, it just knocks into the next line. Does anyone have any questions regarding clear or float? All right, no questions there. Let me go ahead and bring back our nice code for our boxes. It's going to be down below here. All right, our boxes are back. I'm going to app CSS. Take off this position absolute from the box. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show us how to handle for overflow. As of right now, I have a set height to my container. My container has a height of 50 pixels. That is shares with each one of my boxes. Now, if I go and create a couple more boxes, and I continue to number them, Mess that up. All right, there's all of my boxes with some content, but notice that it's flowing out of my container. How do I handle that? How do I make sure that information, when it's being overflowed, it's either hidden or not exposed, or I'm handling to say how is it that I'm supposed to make sure that anything that flows out of this box becomes somewhat responsive, right? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this overflow attribute. And I can say, well, I want overflow to be auto. Well, now by changing it to auto, I now have this scroll bar on the right-hand side. And it's essentially wrapping everything. All right, everything became wrapped. Notice how I'm not utilizing the entire width because I have to make some space for the scroll bar. And it's just setting it for Y, right? My Y index. From top to bottom, I'm able to scroll to see all of the items that are overflowing in this container. Well, I can also say overflow hidden. By saying overflow hidden, now items that I can't see because they're outside of the container, I can't interact with them. Even though they're still occupying space within the division, they're not visible to the user.
Why would you want to do that?
Why would I want to do that? Think about something. Let me see. For example, a pop-up. All right, a pop-up that's in the middle of the screen that you want to be visible to the user once specific conditions are made. Well, you can't just create that pop-up in the middle of the user clicking on something, right? You want that pop-up to already exist. You could create it if you want to utilize vanilla JavaScript, but the easier, more efficient way to do it is to ensure that it's created. It already exists within the HTML context, but it's hidden. The user doesn't see it until they meet specific criteria. Then the pop-up becomes visible. And in order for it to become hidden again, they have to click on a specific button saying that they're done with the pop-up. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right. Perfect. So now the other types of overflow attributes that we can send here is we can say, hey, I want this to be scrollable. If I add scrollable, it gives me both an X and Y scrolling bar that I can interact with. But because I only want my bar to be from top to bottom, I just say overflow Y scroll because it's overflowing down below. And that's handling for overflow. Does anyone have any questions regarding overflow?
When you were doing the initial scroll, what was the attribute that you had on overflow when you first demoed it? I just out on that.
Yeah, it was auto.
Okay, auto. Okay.
So what's the difference between like auto and scroll or flow? Because it seems like they all kind of did the same thing.
Got it. So if you do overflow and you specify auto, you're leaving it up to whatever you're utilizing to make the decision as to what makes the most amount of sense for handling overflow. And it's going to make the decision for you. Take away kind of your control. If you utilize overflow scroll, you're going to get the scrollable items for both an X context, which is down here, down below, and a Y context. You're getting both of them, even though you don't need them. By running overflow Y scroll, you're dictating that the only overflow you'll need to handle will be for scrolling from top to bottom. And that's why you get that scroll bar only on the right-hand side.
So I'm guessing you could do overflow X scroll as well.
That's correct. If I do overflow X, it's only giving me the scroll bar. Oh, interesting. Still gave me Y. I wonder why. But if you do X, it allows you to have that bar at the bottom right-hand side. But it looks like you'll have to handle Y separately there. There you go. Does that answer your question, Jack?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so let's go ahead and add this scroll attribute there. Let's go ahead and get rid of that portion. All right, so there's our scroll attribute. Able to mess around with this. I'm actually going to take this lorem ipsum and this image, or this entire division here. I should have just placed it in a component, actually. I'm going to move it down below just to put things up above in the screen rather than having it at the bottom of the screen. All right. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is going to be pseudo classes. Now, pseudo classes are just classes that you can add some sort of dynamic functionality to it. So, for example, we have this class of box. For this class of box, I can add a pseudo class. I can say, hey, for this box, if anything hovers over it, then I want you to do the following. I want you to change the background color to yellow. And maybe I want you to change the height to, I don't know, 55 pixels. And the width to 55 pixels. Well, now by doing that, when I hover over a specific box, we can see that it changes in height and width to 55. And it also turns the background color to yellow. We did a similar behavior to this by adding an event listener with JavaScript earlier in the full stack week. But now instead of writing it all with JavaScript, we could just add a CSS dynamic class. These are called pseudo classes that just adds a little bit of functionality. There's a couple of different ones. There's link. You can also add for hover, checked, if something is valid, focused. There's a lot of pseudo classes out there. We're not going to cover all of them. In this example, we'll just cover hover just to show the functionality of it, but know that there's plenty other out there that exist. Does anyone have any questions regarding pseudo classes? Okay, perfect. I know this was more of a checklist kind of lecture, but these are all tools and great tools that we can utilize to make sure that we are getting some nice responsive designs inside of our website. In the second portion of our lecture, we're going to talk about Flexbox and different size tags, but this is going to conclude the first portion of our lecture. Let me go ahead and pause the recording here. Welcome, everyone. In part 2 of our lecture, we're going to be talking about units of measurements for responsive web design. Now, so far, what we've seen is for units of measurements are going to be pixels. But today, we're going to talk about percentages and a couple of other units of measurements that we can utilize to make sure that our website stays reactive. So let's go ahead and start doing that. I'm just going to have two divisions here, both of them with a class of box. So there's my two divisions. I'm not really going to place anything inside of them. I'm just going to go into app CSS and create my box here. Now my box is going to have a simple height and width. And let's do 75 pixels and a width of 75 pixels. Now inside of both of those boxes, I'm going to go ahead and actually I'm going to give the box 1 and box 2. So let me go ahead and add that ID of box 1 and then an ID of box 2. All right. For box 1, I'm going to go ahead and add a border that will be of 1 pixel. Solid. We'll go ahead and stick to our casual black there. And then for box 2, we'll do the same. We'll add a border. In this case, we'll make it 1 pixel, dashed. And let's make it red so we can kind of visualize it. All right, so there we see our nested boxes. They're within one another. But currently, when I utilize my box, or at least a box, we can see that 75 pixels is kind of a definitive thing, right? If I go here into my inspector tools, and this is actually a really cool and useful tool to use whenever I'm developing websites, I like to start small as possible, and then work my way up. I think the smallest one they have here that you could choose from is an iPhone SE. And there it shows you what your website would look like in an iPhone SE. Let me see if I go ahead and zoom in to 100%. So here's the website. You could also have it to where it's just responsive. You could just move your site around. Here's the smallest I'm able to make it, the bigger I'm able to make it. But there's not really much response, right? If I'm working a screen that's this small, I probably don't want my image to be that big or this box to be that big. And if I was working on a screen that was this wide, I would probably want my image to grow. Well, that's where our units of measurements are going to come in. So let's start talking about these real quick. All right, the first ones that I want to talk about are going to be percentages. Percentages are in relation to the parent. And let me actually change this here because the parent of this is going to be root. And that's the reason why that is messing up. Just going to leave this one at 75 pixels actually. And then let me change this here. All right, so everything is in relation to the parent. Meaning, you can see box 1 is occupying 75% of my screen. There's this 25% left over on the right-hand side. All right, so that's my 25% and my really bad. Oh, wow. This is a lot harder than it looks like. All right, there's my 25% right there, right? That I'm missing out. This entire screen up to here, where this border cuts us off, would be 100%. So currently, 75% is using that portion of my screen. Now the inner box is using 75% as well for the width, but it's in relation to the parent. So my parent division is at 75% of the screen. But my child inside is at 75% of its parent division. So box 2 is only 75% of the width of box 1, with this being our good old 25% there, and the box being 75% there. All right, so percentages will always be in reference to the parent division or the parent component, whatever you want to call it. Whoever its parent is, it will occupy that size or percentage of that parent. Now let's take a look at what happens when I utilize this reactive. Oh, go ahead and there you go, responsive. Well, now as my screen gets smaller, notice that my boxes also get smaller. I'm able to squeeze my box a lot more now. And as my screen gets bigger, so does my 2 divisions. Does anyone have any questions regarding percentages? No questions regarding percentages. Okay, perfect. If there are no questions regarding percentages, then let's start talking about view width and view height. So we're still going to stay within our boxes here. But now, for this height component, currently I'm using 175 pixels. If I squeeze my screen, it still stays at 175 pixels, regardless of how small my screen is. Nothing is really changing in the reaction, right? I could squeeze left and right, and that's being reactive because I'm utilizing percentage signs. But if I take a look at my height, nothing is changing. Well, if I want to target something specific, like the viewport height, well, I can run something like 25 of the view height. So 25% of the view height now is defined, and it's utilized to measure my height of my component. As the screen gets wider, you can see that everything's being reactive. And as the screen gets shorter, it's still becoming reactive. The child component is still only occupying 75%. At this point, it's so small that the margin, or excuse me, the border is actually running over. And that's why we start seeing that fade away of 75%, but it's still there. And now we have a reactive component. All right, so view height is in percentages specifically to the viewport height. It has no relation to the parent division. It is only taking a look at the entire viewport height. So this is my viewport. It doesn't care about the parent division anymore. It is only looking for how the viewport is changing. So with that said, we can also change something like the width. You can say, well, I also want the width to change to where I have 75% of the view width. And now by adding 75% of the view width, you'll see that both my nested, because they both share the same width, box 2 and box 1 share the same width. They're exactly the same. And as I close them and open them, they're reacting to the viewport width. If I wanted the width of box 2 to be reactive to the parent, then I would just add the percentage. I would say, well, I just want this to be 75%. All right. Any questions regarding view width, view height, or the difference between percentages and view width and view height? Perfect. Seems like we have no questions. Now, I myself don't like to utilize view width and view height. This is just a personal preference. The reason why I don't like to use them is because if I'm working within something like boxes, and let's say that I wanted to create a box where they match as far as their height and width, right? So there's my good old box there. The height and width is 75. Well, now, regardless of how the width of my application changes, my box doesn't really get smaller until the entire screen starts zooming out, right? But the viewport height remains the same. Now, if the viewport height starts shortening up, my entire box gets smaller, and that's not necessarily something that I want. Maybe I don't want it to be dependent on either the height or the width. Maybe I wanted to make a decision on whichever one of the two is the biggest or the smallest component. So in this case, what I would utilize is something like vmin. So by using vmin, what this is going to do is it's going to create a question. The question is going to be something like, hey, is height greater than width? If so, it's going to utilize the width as the source of truth. Otherwise, it would utilize the height. So let's take a look at that. Vmin. As of right now, I'm going to open up the port for height. And you'll see that as I'm shortening up the width, the size of my boxes changes. Now, if I shorten up the height, nothing happens. And it won't happen until after the height becomes smaller than the width. Now that the height is smaller than the width, it helps compress those two squares. All right, so height's the smaller component in this case, so that's going to be what it uses as its source of truth. Now the opposite could be said for Vmax. The only thing that's changing here is now it's saying, well, is height less than width? And if it is, then it's going to utilize width. Otherwise, it will utilize height. Right, you'll notice that the height is staying at 435. So nothing is changing as far as my box goes. But the moment the box is now greater, well, as the screen gets wider, so does the image. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding those units of measurements there? Okay, doesn't seem like we have any questions. That's going to be it as far as those reactive units of measurements for shapes. But now let's talk a little bit about text specifically. We'll go into app.jsx. I'm going to create an example for text here. And here I'm going to have a division class, a div with the class of rem, or let's just say, let's call it holder. Oh, excuse me. That will have a paragraph tag plus div of text holder with, again, a paragraph tag plus the div of text holder and one last paragraph tag. All right. Here I'm just going to write wow for all of these. They're all in display block. Even though they're nested within one another, we don't really see a change as to how it's being displayed for now. I'm actually going to exit this responsive design portal here. All right. Well, if we go into app.css, we can do something like amplifying the text here. And we do that utilizing the class that we passed in of text holder. All right. This class is then going to use both em and rem. So let's go ahead and pass those two. Let's say font size and say 3em. Well, you notice that when I utilize 3em, it starts amplifying each one of them. Oh, maybe I should do something a little bit smaller. So we have our first div of 2em. I could even go as small as 1em. If I use 1em, everything stays the same size. If I use 2em, it starts growing. The further nested it is, the bigger the text will become. And if I use something like rem instead of em, it flattens it out. So the R stands for regulated. That's how it keeps it all flattened out at 2em. Without the R, it's not regulated, so it becomes emphasized at every level. Does anyone have any questions regarding rem or em?
Can you provide it negative values or decimal values?
Let's try it out. We add a negative value, it just flattens it out to 1 em. It doesn't go any lower than that. And if we want to pass it something like decimal values, like 1.5, decimal values could be accepted and it would be able to process them.
So is there a way to reverse it where the lower nested you are, the bigger it is? Like a DM, de-emphasize?
Yeah. Well, I think the way you would handle that would be something like this. And I'm going to be going into this here shortly, but I just want to check if it works really quick. Oh, it doesn't work because it's nested within one another. Interesting. I don't know of any commands off the top of my head that would be able to flip this upside down. I'm sure with enough CSS, you could probably do it, but I don't know off the top of my head to answer your question, Tim.
All right.
All right. Awesome.
I'm sorry, could you re-explain REM? I guess I'm just not understanding it, just because I saw everything was the same size when you did it.
Yeah, when you utilize REM, what it does is it regulates it. So it makes sure that regardless of how nested it is, the emphasis stays the same for all of the text. When you take off the R, it's not regulated. So it allows it to essentially think about it like an exponential value, right? At each level, it's times 2. But by adding the R, we get rid of this times portion.
Jason, is the REM confusing you because it stays the same? Like if you change the number before the REM, are you asking if it'll adjust all of them to
Well,
different size?
I guess what's the point? Because I mean, everything was already the same size before. So if you add REM, it's like, cool, it's still the same size. I guess I don't.
It's the default emphasis of it. So let me go ahead and show you this as well. I apologize. This might be my lack of demonstration here. The text also becomes a bit reactive, right? So if I take off the regulated and it's just emphasize, actually it doesn't. Interesting. You're essentially saying like, what's the whole point of having this styling? Which is a good question. I'll have to look into that and get back to you as well. I just know it's a tool that you could have in your toolbox. I haven't used it as far as an actual practical application.
What happens if you change the number before EM to like 5? Does it get bigger and then all of them will be bigger, or does it matter?
Yes, all of them will
Okay.
become bigger.
Okay.
So as I scroll down, eventually we get to this point.
Yeah, so the emphasis between the sizes are bigger too. Like maybe each
If I put
preceding
the
one
R,
is
it
five
all
bigger than, like the next one will be like 5 bigger than the next one. So it's just crazy.
yeah. All right. Let's see. The last portion we're going to talk about here, it's going to be Flexbox, and Flexbox is a good one. I very much like to utilize Flexbox. So let me go ahead and bring back our nice little row with a container. With a couple of boxes inside of it. There you go. Let's that up. There you go. All right, so there's my container with my boxes. All of them have divisions. Let me go ahead and alter this container really quick here. This container, I'm going to use a little bit of responsive units here. I'm going to add some height with view height. And I'm going to add the width of, let's say, let's go with 100 VW. Let's make the border solid, make it blue, and make it 1 VMin. All right, so there's my container. Looks like I have 2 of them. Get rid of this one since I don't need it. There you go. We can see that some of that CSS is overlapping. Let's go into our height component here, or excuse me, our boxes. Let's make sure our boxes share some of the parent component here. There's 10 of them. So I want to make sure that they do have a border. I'm going to make this border dashed for every single one of them. Make it red. And I'm going to make sure that the border is 1%. Doesn't seem to accept that as a unit of measurement. So let's go with pixels for now. Now I'm going to make my width, or excuse me. I'm going to make the width here be 10%. And I'm going to make the height be 25 VH. Just so I could match it. All right, so there's our boxes. They're all clashing against each other. And the goal here is that when we flush it out, let's go ahead and make a smaller number here. Maybe something like 90 would do the trick. I want that. That when we flush it out, meaning that everything gets straightened out, all of our boxes would be from left to the right-hand side. Now, what we just learned recently is that we could do it from the child level by adding something like display inline block. All right, if we do display inline block, we could get all 10 of our boxes fitting inside. Awesome. But instead, I'm going to do it from the parent, from the container. I'm going to add display and make this flex. And by adding display flex, you'll see that it's using 10% of the width. Everything's fitting the way it's supposed to. And it's utilizing 25 view height, just like the container right up above. I could simply switch this height to 100%. That was just 100% of the container. And nothing would change there. All right. Now, what else does this give me? Well, I can specify something like flex direction. And I could say something like row reverse. And that would reverse all of my numbers pretty easily. I can also switch this to be in column. And that would almost show them as if they were in display block. And I still have the reverse argument there. I can add column reverse, and it would flip them from 10 down to 1. Now, something a little bit more useful here. Let's go ahead and take off 6 of these boxes. Now we're down to 5. And let's say that I want my container to be able to continuously spread them out. And notice that as the container is getting smaller, so is the width of my boxes itself. Well, now that I have my flex direction of, oh, that should not be flex, that should be row. Now that I have all that flex direction and everything specified, I can do something like justify content. And with justify content, I can move everything to the right. Or I can add some space around. If I add space around, you'll notice that there's space around each individual item. And it's all pretty much spaced evenly without me having to worry about it or specify a unit of measurement. I can also do something like space between. And by space between, the only difference is that now the outermost elements are actually touching the edge of the container, right? The box of number 1 is touching the edge of the container, and the box of number 5 is touching the right-hand edge of the container. Finally, there's something like space or justify content center, and that will center all 5 of our boxes. I can also just specify something like, after I have everything in center, I can add a gap. And for this gap, I can say, well, I want this gap to be 5 VW. And now I would add a gap. Everything is still centered. It has no regards as to the left and right-hand side of the container. It's just adding a gap between all the elements of 5 VW.
So if you didn't have the display flex and you tried to use flex direction, justify content, and gap, you wouldn't be able to use them. You have to use display flex to be able to use those attributes.
So flex direction and display flex, you wouldn't be able to use them. Oh,
Okay.
let me go ahead and show that here. That takes away my justify content as well.
Okay.
And it also takes away the gap.
Okay, so it's dependent on setting display flex first before you can manipulate any of those.
Exactly. What is going on? There it is.
So in a way, flex is kind of give display flex is giving you the flexibility to add a few more, give you a little more control if you didn't, have display flex.
Right. So display flex gives me a lot more functionality than I would have without it.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah. All right, let's bring back these other boxes here. Let's actually add another 5. Notice everything's getting really squeezed now. I'm actually starting to get a little bit of an overflow where things don't necessarily fit. It's trying to make sure that it all fits, but it's running into an issue as far as sizing goes. And some of them are even breaking the width that I passed it. Well, when you utilize something like display flex, it's going to try to match this. But if it decides that this is way too wide, it's going to disregard the width and dictate its own. So in order to fix that, you have to pass a min width argument. Now by passing min width, everything gets kind of not necessarily squeezed, but everything's holding that 10% the entire time. But now I have an overflow issue. Well, I need to tell just this flex content. I could take off that justify content center, and now we see 1 being the first element. And then I need to tell my site how to handle for this overflow. So now I can say flex wrap, and the default will be of wrapping or of no wrap, but I want it to wrap instead. Now, when I pass that wrap functionality, it starts dropping it down below while still maintaining that 5V width. If I were to take off this height attribute that I have here, it would become a parent and still open up. The more boxes that I have, the wider it would get. All right, so now I have this flex wrap. Everything's wrapping around. I could still add a justify content if I really wanted to. It would just look weird. All right, so there's 1 through 6, 7 through 8, and then the bottom 3 elements are the ones that are centered. And then everything else would just be as simple as continuing the overflow that we've learned, right? So I would add something like overflow Y. make it scrollable. And there you go. Now I have a scrollable container that's holding all 15 of my boxes inside of it with flex wrap. There's a couple of other applications when it comes to Flex, and Flex is very versatile. A lot of developers, or there's an ongoing joke about being able to center a division. Oops. So right now I'm going to have these two divisions, and then I'll show how we could center divisions here shortly. So let me go into app CSS. I'm going to grab out. This out is going to be of, let me actually address this center division class first. By adding a border of 5 pixels, solid, and let's just make it black. All right, so out will have a height of 30 vmin, and then a width of 30 vmin. Guess I could make this percentages. Interesting. What can I do here? Yep, that's what I'm gonna do. There you go. What is happening with that box in there? Now we're running into CSS problems. Interesting. Let me try to debug this here. All right, let me take a look at some stylings here. I can see the height of 50% is being applied, but it's not referencing the parent for some reason. App.jsx, yep. Hmm. There you go. So there we have our boxes. We have our outer box and we have our inner box there. Now I want to center this division. A lot of developers have problems with centering things. The best way to do it, or the easiest way to do it, is just add the display flex. Now this isn't a one-stop shop. It's not always going to be what works best for you. You could justify content and add a center. You'll see that that centers it within that parent division. And then align items center. And that centers it every time. All right. If I go into inspect, you'll see that it's still centered. I could go into my responsive portal there and it stays centered regardless of the size of the screen.
What happens if you put additional content in that outer box? How does it affect the centering of the inner box?
Excuse me. So you're saying like if I add another box?
Or just add text?
Oh, yeah. So if I add more text, well then at that point, we're going to have
the inside the outer box, not the inner.
that is the outer box.
Oh yeah, my bad. Yeah.
No problem. Yeah, so now we're going to have problems when it comes to actually being able to center information. Because by adding text or by adding another essentially brother to the children, then its spacing is out of whack. It's not going to be able to center it the way we want it to. So if you wanted to do something along this lines or these lines, you would have to add a parental division.
So do you recommend everything should have its own division in order to keep things within the parameters that you want it to avoid things like
Yeah.
this?
Yes, I wouldn't say everything needs to have its own division, but just know what creates a grouping, right? So if these two are meant to be a grouping, then that should have its own parent division, and so on. It's just about visualizing the boxes inside of boxes, for lack of better words. Does that address your question, Tim?
It does. How is there any way, like having that lorem ipsum in there, to have the box or the text go around that inner division? Can you float it with the center instead of a right left?
So you're saying keeping the division here, but having the text on the left and the right-hand side?
Yeah, the just having the text around that inner box
Got it.
inside the outer box.
Let me see if we can do that here.
I suck at CSS and it drives me crazy, so I'm trying to.
Yeah, this is a good question. At this point, I'm experimenting because I don't know off the top of my head. But let me try this out. All right, so out p tag. Nope. Out div. I want this to float center. Nope, that didn't work. Doesn't seem like it's allowing me to float it, and I do have it first. So it's not allowing me to float it. It's likely because of the display flex. It's getting in the way of this floating attribute. Let me double check here. Let me make sure the correcting is selected. So my display flex, everything's working well there. Here you go. So the float right is being applied, but it's just not floating it. Yeah, because the float right is being applied, but we have texture down below. It's not floating it.
Yeah, it's not a big deal. I was just curious.
Yeah. I'll have to look into that. Good question. All right, let me go ahead and take that off here. Go into app and remove that portion. Okay, perfect. Excuse me, everyone. All right, so now we have our boxes. We have a scrollable content that we can move around. And maybe there's a couple of other, maybe there's one more thing that we can cover here. That's going to be media queries. So media queries, it's the last step of responsive design, and it's just ensuring that things can get smaller or bigger depending on the screen size. For example, let's take a look at the Pokey API here. All right, so on the Pokey API, I have a screen here. If I open it up, as I close my browser, you'll notice that the nav bar completely disappears. Then I get this add here. And that's happening as soon as my screen meets a minimum size. So the screen meets a minimum size and the component that's being rendered above changes from a navigation bar to some sort of ad. So the displaying of whatever is deciding what's being demonstrated up there changes depending on the media query. Well, how could we mimic something like that? Let's go ahead and create a similar effect here. Let's do a nav. And here we'll have an unordered list with a couple of list items here that are going to be anchors. There you go. All right. Take a look at our project. Here we have our nav bar with link. Let's go ahead and go into app CSS. Let's address this nav bar here. So we're going to grab the nav component. We're going to give it a background color of red. We're going to make sure that everything's in display flex. We're going to justify content space around. Oh, and that's happening from here. So let me go ahead and grab this portion. There you go. So there's our nav bar with three separate links. And what we want to do is that once it reaches a specific width, instead of showing the nav bar with a background of red, for simplicity's sake, not to make things complicated and add a whole another component, we're just going to make sure to add a media query that would change the background color of the nav bar to gold. Well, what would that look like? As of now, I could go into my inspector tools. And if I take this off, it tells me on the upper right-hand corner of the screen, the width of my screen. We can see it go down all the way to 440 and so on. So let's say that once it gets down to 300 pixels, we want it to change to gold.
I'm sorry, how did you do that real quick? You mind just recapping how you have the pixels in the top right corner or the mobile or the screen size? Okay.
All I'm doing is grabbing this division here or this divider, and I'm manipulating it from left to right while my inspector tools are open.
Okay.
And that gives me the screen size. If that doesn't work for you, you could go into the responsive portion. And as you squeeze this, you can see the numbers on the top where this is representing the width and this is representing the height.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you for pausing me. I want to make that's important for everybody to know how to do that. All right. So now let's go ahead and add our media query there. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to say, hey, at media, what I want to change is at max width of 300 pixels. I want nav to have a color, or excuse me, a background color of gold. Or let's go with golden one. Why not? So now let's take a look whenever we inspect. All right, we already see that it's at 267. When I move this to 300 pixels, it's still golden. And the moment I reach 301 pixels, it goes back to red. So 300 pixels, we're at golden because that's the max width. So meaning at 300 pixels, trigger this CSS. Anything above 300 pixels, that CSS will not be triggered. I could also add something like, hey, well, for the entire body, I want the color of font to change to, let's go with brown for simplicity's sake. You can see that all of the text in the body changed to the color brown the moment I reach 300 pixels. Now, what happens if I switch this around? What if I say min width? Well, that means anything above 300 will trigger that CSS, and anything below 300 pixels will return the original CSS from up above. And that's media queries. Does anyone have any questions regarding media queries?
For arrangement purposes, would it probably be good to have the media queries like on the bottom of your CSS?
Yes, I would always put media queries at the bottom of CSS. Yes. And then whenever you style your sites or you start building a project, start with the smallest screen possible and then work your way outboards to a wider screen. All right, perfect. Does it seem like there are any questions? I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording here.